There is a specific kind of loneliness found in hotel rooms. A feeling that you are just a guest in a space where hundreds have slept before. But tonight, these guests found out they weren't as alone as they thought. The door handle is turning. It's slow, deliberate, and clicking with a rhythmic, metallic hunger that makes my skin crawl. I'm shoved against the wood, my heels skidding on the cheap carpet. If this lock snaps, I am a dead man. The Polaroid is clutched in my shaking hand. It's still warm, the chemical smell of developing film stinging my nostrils. In the photo, I am lying right there on that bed. I'm fast asleep, mouth open, completely oblivious to the camera. The terrifying part isn't the photo itself. It's that the person holding the camera is visible in the mirror's reflection. I checked into room 422 at exactly 3:14 p.m. The air smelled of stale cigarettes and lemon-scented industrial bleach. The wallpaper was a nauseating shade of mustard yellow. It looked like it was sweating under the flickering fluorescent lights of the hallway. The front desk clerk hadn't looked up once. He just slid me a heavy brass key that felt unnaturally cold. I noticed something strange when I hung my coat. The digital clock on the bedside table was counting backward, 1 second at a time. I ignored it, chalking it up to a cheap circuit board malfunction. I just needed 6 hours of solid, dreamless sleep. The bed felt like a slab of granite. I threw my bag onto the chair and kicked off my shoes, exhausted. A faint scratching sound came from inside the mattress. It sounded like a dry fingernail dragging slowly across the inner springs. I sat up, pulse quickening, but the sound stopped instantly. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost pressurized against my ears. I decided to splash some water on my face. The bathroom mirror was old, warped, and showed me having 3 eyes. I blinked, and the reflection corrected itself. It was just a trick of the glass, a common distortion in budget motels. I reached for a towel and felt something stiff. Tucked behind the metal rack was a small, white square. It was a Polaroid, face down. I picked it up, my thumb brushing the glossy, chemical-slick surface of the film. The image resolved slowly, bleeding from a murky gray into a sharp, horrifying clarity. It was a shot of me. A wet, heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards. It felt like someone had dropped a sack of meat in the room above. In the photo, I'm sitting on the bed. I'm wearing the exact shirt I have on right now. The angle is from the corner of the ceiling. There are no vents there, no cameras, just solid, peeling plaster. The photo shows me looking at my phone. But in the background, the bathroom door is slightly cracked open. A pale, elongated hand is visible in the gap. It has too many knuckles, and the skin looks like wet parchment. A sudden, sharp whistle blew from the sink drain. It sounded like a human scream squeezed through a tiny, rusted needle. I dropped the photo as if it were white hot. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my chest. I looked at the bathroom door in the real world. It was wide open, just as I had left it moments ago. Then, I noticed the shadow on the floor. It wasn't moving with me. It was stretching toward the bed. I grabbed my bag, lunging for the heavy door. The brass handle wouldn't budge, feeling fused to the frame. I yanked until my knuckles turned white and raw. The door wasn't locked. It felt like it had become a wall. A wet, rhythmic slapping started under the floorboards. It sounded like bare, soaked feet running in a tight circle. I turned to the window, desperate for any air. The glass was cold, colder than ice, and completely opaque, like solid milk. I hammered my fist against the pane, expecting a crack. It felt like hitting a slab of reinforced, prehistoric rubber. My reflection in the glass didn't move when I did. It just stood there, staring back with a wide, toothless grin. I scrambled back toward the bed, reaching for the phone. The plastic receiver felt like it was made of warm, pulsing skin. I dialed 911, but there was no dial tone, just the sound of someone breathing heavily into a metal bucket. A low, vibrating hum began to shake the furniture. It made the water in the toilet bowl ripple in perfect, concentric squares. "Help!" I screamed, but the sound died in my throat. The room seemed to be absorbing the very frequency of my voice. I looked down at the Polaroid I had dropped earlier. The image had changed. Now, the pale hand was touching my shoulder. I felt a sudden, icy pressure on my actual collarbone. I spun around, but the space behind me was violently, impossibly empty. I scrambled to the corner of the room. My eyes darted to the digital clock. It was still ticking backward. The numbers were no longer red, but a deep, bruised purple. They were counting down to a zero I didn't want to see. A heavy, wet thump hit the ceiling directly above me. It sounded like a massive, waterlogged sponge hitting a hardwood floor. I looked at the floorboards near the radiator. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep upward through the gaps. It wasn't blood, it was printer ink, thick and smelling of ozone. It pooled into the shape of a footprint. Another footprint appeared, then another, leading straight toward me. There was nobody there to make them, just the ink. I checked the Polaroid again, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. The image had shifted once more. Now, the version of me in the photo was looking at the camera. His eyes were wide, and he was screaming silently. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the bathroom mirror. A single, perfect spiderweb fracture bloomed across the center of the glass. The ink footprints stopped exactly 2 inches from my toes. The air around them shimmered with a heat I couldn't feel. I realized the pattern. Every time the clock hit a multiple of 10, the room changed. It was a countdown of physical decay. I held my breath as the clock hit 10:40. The yellow wallpaper began to peel back like sunburnt skin. Underneath the paper wasn't wood or drywall. It was a layer of old, grayish photographs of people sleeping. I reached out and touched one of the photos. It was warm, and I could feel a faint, rhythmic pulse underneath. I peeled back a corner of the photograph on the wall. It was a photo of my childhood bedroom. My breath hitched as I saw my favorite stuffed bear. It was ripped open, its stuffing replaced with human hair. The room groaned as if it were a living thing. A low, guttural moan vibrated through the very springs of the bed. I looked at the bedside table and saw my wallet. It was open, but my ID didn't show my face. The plastic card showed a photo of me screaming. It was the exact scream I gave when I was 6. I fell out of a tree and broke my arm. Nobody was there to see it, or so I thought. A sudden, sharp smell of ozone filled the room. It smelled like a lightning strike inside a closed, padded cell. The wallpaper began to whisper in 1,000 different voices. They were all my voice, at every age I've been. "You shouldn't have come back," the wall hissed. The words were formed by bubbles of black ink. I remember the secret I told only to the dark. I whispered it once into a storm when I was 10. The ink on the floor began to form that secret. It spelled out the name of the girl I couldn't save. The closet door creaked open just an inch or two. A pair of my own old sneakers walked out, empty. They stepped toward me with a heavy, rhythmic thud. Each step sounded like a gavel hitting a wooden block. I realized the room wasn't just haunting me. It was harvesting every regret I had ever tried to bury. I lunged for my smartphone, desperate for any light. The screen was a bright, static-filled rectangle of white. I tried to call my mother, but the contacts were gone. Every name had been replaced with room 422. A heavy, metallic clang rang out from the hallway. It sounded like a massive iron bolt sliding home. I threw my shoulder against the door once more. It didn't even rattle. It was as solid as a tomb. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The darkness that followed was thick, almost oily. I could hear the city outside, just a faint hum. It felt 1,000 miles away, on another planet. A rhythmic, wet scratching started against the outside window. Something was trying to climb in from the 4-story drop. The air in the room grew thin and freezing. I could see my breath blooming in the pale moonlight. The digital clock was the only light left now. It pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic, violet glow. I screamed for the neighbors, pounding the thin walls. My fists met only a soft, yielding, organic substance. The walls weren't drywall anymore. They were soft skin. I could feel a rib cage beneath the floral pattern. I was trapped inside a giant, breathing, architectural lung. The room was inhaling, and I was the dust. I reached for the Polaroid one last time, my fingers brushing the damp, gelatinous surface of the image. The photo didn't show the room anymore. It showed a wide, surgical view of my own internal organs. In the center of my liver, there was a tiny, brass room key with the number 422 etched in red. A sudden, violent cramp doubled me over, my stomach knotting into a hard, pulsating ball of cold iron. I coughed, and a thick, oily Polaroid slid out of my throat, landing face up on the meat-slicked floorboards. The new photo showed me from the inside out, looking through my own ribs at a dark, crouched figure. I looked down at my own chest and saw a seam of black stitches stretching from my navel to my chin. The stitches weren't thread, they were tiny, coiled strips of developed film, showing every second of my life. I realized then that I wasn't the guest in this hotel room. I was the film being developed inside of it. The digital clock finally hit 0, and the violet light died with a wet, final pop. The room didn't go dark. It began to glow with the pale, sickly luminescence of a developing photo. I reached for the door handle one last time, but my hand passed through the metal like smoke. I looked down and saw my body was becoming flat, two-dimensional, and framed by a white, plastic border. The ceiling began to press down, not with weight, but with the crushing force of a camera lens. A blinding flash erupted from the bathroom mirror, searing the image of my screaming face into the wallpaper. I am no longer in room 422. I am tucked behind the metal towel rack, waiting to be found. The door finally clicked open, and I heard the heavy, tired footsteps of a man dropping his bags. He smells of stale cigarettes and lemon bleach, and he is reaching for the towel to dry his face. I am the Polaroid, face down, and I am still warm to the touch. Finding a photo is one thing. Finding a message is another. Our next account involves a traveler who realized that the most dangerous part of a hotel isn't who is in the hallway. It's who is behind the mirror. I've got the duct tape tied around my daughter's wrists. She's screaming, but her reflection in the hallway mirror is just smiling. I have to smash it. If I don't break every glass surface in this house in the next 30 seconds, we aren't making it out. The silver backing of the mirror is bubbling like boiling water. I can see Lily's friend reaching through the glass, fingers elongating like pulled taffy. My hammer hits the surface, but the glass doesn't shatter. It ripples. It feels like hitting a wall of cold, gelatinous meat. Lily stops screaming. She looks at me with eyes that are suddenly, impossibly blue, even though her eyes have been brown since the day she was born. Everything started 3 weeks ago with a smudge on the bathroom tile. Just a small, gray blur that wouldn't scrub away no matter how hard I rubbed. The house felt heavy, like the air was being replaced by something thicker. I noticed the kitchen clock was ticking backwards, but only when I looked at it through a reflection. Lily began talking to the hallway mirror at 3 a.m. every single night. She called her friend the other Lily, which felt like typical kid stuff at first. But then I noticed the impossible detail. Lily was wearing her favorite red hoodie, but in the mirror, the zipper was on the wrong side. I laughed it off, thinking I was just tired from the graveyard shifts. Then I saw the shadows moving independently of the light source in the den. The micro-shock happened when I went to brush my teeth. I spat into the sink, but the reflection of the spit stayed hovering in midair. I checked my pulse. My heart was beating in my neck, but the reflection's throat was perfectly still and frozen like a photograph. Lily started eating with her left hand, despite being a dedicated righty since preschool. She didn't even seem to notice the change in her own grip. The atmosphere in the hallway turned freezing, even though the thermostat was cranked up to 80. My breath didn't fog the air, but the mirror did. I found a note Lily drew. It was a picture of our house, but the front door was drawn on the roof. I walked into the kitchen and saw Lily staring at a bowl of dry cereal. She wasn't moving. I called her name 3 times before she turned around. Her face looked like a mask that didn't quite fit her bones. "The friend wants to play a game, Daddy," she whispered. Her voice sounded like 2 people speaking at the exact same time. I felt a sharp, icy draft. I looked at the window, but the glass showed a summer day while it was snowing outside. I reached out to touch her shoulder. My hand passed right through her skin like she was made of thick, cold smoke. I jumped back, tripping over the rug. Lily didn't blink. She just kept staring at the spot where I had been standing. A low, vibrating hum started coming from the walls. It was the sound of 1,000 mirrors vibrating in their frames all at once. I looked at my own reflection in the toaster. My face was missing its mouth, just a smooth, blank stretch of pale skin. I screamed, but the sound didn't come from my throat. It came from the reflection in the microwave across the room. Lily began to laugh, but her mouth stayed perfectly closed. The sound was wet, bubbly, and filled with a strange, metallic static. I grabbed her hand to pull her away. Her skin felt like cold marble, polished and completely devoid of any human warmth. The lights flickered, and for 1 microsecond, the entire room inverted. Left was right, up was down, and my heart was on the wrong side. I dragged Lily toward the front door, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My hand was numb from her cold skin. I grabbed the brass deadbolt, but it didn't turn. It felt like it was painted onto the wood, a flat, 2-dimensional lie. I looked back at the hallway mirror. The other Lily was stepping out, her foot landing on our carpet without a sound. A loud crack echoed through the house. The ceiling light shattered, but the glass fell upward, embedding itself into the plaster above. I grabbed a heavy chair and hurled it at the living room window. It bounced off with a dull thud, like hitting a rubber tire. Lily wasn't resisting anymore. She was just heavy, an anchor pulling me down into the floorboards. I screamed for the neighbors, pounding on the glass. Through the pane, I saw Mr. Henderson walking his dog, completely oblivious. The micro shock hit when I saw his dog. It had 2 tails, wagging in perfect, terrifying synchronization, one mirror perfect to the other. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the heavy cast iron skillet. I began hammering at the sliding glass door with everything I had. The glass didn't break, it bruised. Dark, purple welts began to form on the transparent surface where I struck it. I looked at Lily, and her reflection was now standing behind me in the room. There were 2 of them now. The reflection reached out and touched my back. I felt a surge of electricity that smelled like ozone and rotting lilies. Every time I blinked, the other Lily moved 4 inches closer. It was a rhythmic, stuttering crawl that ignored the laws of physics. I tried to look away, but my eyelids felt like they were made of heavy lead. I couldn't stop watching her. The pattern was clear. Every time the grandfather clock chimed, the house shifted its internal geometry. The hallway grew longer. I ran toward the kitchen, but I ended up back in the master bedroom. The door I just left was now a window. A sharp pop came from the vanity mirror. A single drop of black liquid rolled upward, defying gravity toward the ceiling. I checked my watch. The second hand was moving in leaps of 5. Time was being swallowed by the glass. I tried to scream, but the sound only came out when I looked into the silver backing of a spoon. Sound was trapped too. Lily sat on the floor, stacking blocks that weren't there. Her hands moved in perfect, mirrored arcs through the empty air. The micro shock hit when I saw her shadow. It was standing up while she was sitting down, watching me with intent. I threw a blanket over the vanity. The fabric didn't drape. It hovered, frozen in a ripple as if caught in midair. I counted to 10, hoping the shift would reset the rooms. On 7, the floor turned into a polished, dark reflection. I was standing on myself. My own face stared back from beneath my boots, blinking in a slow, agonizing delay. The walls began to bleed a silver mercury-like substance. It pooled around my feet, rising higher with every tick of the clock. I grabbed Lily and hoisted her onto the bed. The mattress felt like it was filled with broken, grinding glass shards. The silver liquid on the floor didn't just pool, it began to form shapes. Faces I knew. My mother, my ex-wife. The reflection of my mother opened its mouth and spoke with a voice that sounded like grinding teeth and old memories. "You always were a liar, weren't you, David?" she hissed. The sound came from the vents, not her lips. A micro shock hit when the reflection of my wedding ring began to glow a hot, searing white against my skin. The other Lily stood at the foot of the bed, her face melting into a version of my own at 10 years old. She recited the exact words I'd whispered into the dark the night my father left. Secrets no one else could possibly know. I covered my ears, but the sound didn't stop. It was echoing inside my own skull, vibrating against my jawbone. The walls began to display scenes from my childhood, but every memory ended with me dying in a different, horrific way. I saw myself drowning in the bathtub. I saw myself falling from the oak tree. The glass was documenting my failures. The other Lily reached out and touched my cheek. Her finger felt like a needle made of absolute, sub-zero cold. "You don't belong on this side anymore," she whispered. Her breath smelled like the attic of a house that burned down. I looked at my hands and saw they were becoming translucent. I could see the bed sheets through my own palms. The microshock came when I looked at my pulse. The vein in my wrist was pumping backwards, pushing blood toward my fingertips. I wasn't the one holding Lily anymore. My reflection was holding her. I was the one being held by the glass. I tried to call the police, but my phone screen was just a mirror reflecting my own terrified, silver eyes. The signal bars didn't drop. They turned into tiny, jagged glass shards that pierced the skin of my thumb. I ran to the front door, but the wood had been replaced by a seamless, cold sheet of polished obsidian. The micro shock hit when I looked out the peephole. There was no street, no sky, just an infinite hallway of mirrors. I pounded on the walls, but the drywall felt like frozen meat. It didn't thud, it squelched under my desperate fists. Every light bulb in the house hummed once and then sucked the light inward, leaving a pulsing, negative glow. I reached for the light switch, but it snapped off like a brittle bone. No wires, just a hollow, dark void. Lily was standing in the center of the living room. She wasn't Lily anymore. She was a static-filled silhouette. The microshock came when I realized I couldn't hear my own heartbeat. The house had stolen the rhythm for itself. I checked the kitchen clock again. The hands had fallen off and were crawling across the face like silver spiders. I was trapped in a box of reflections. Every direction I turned, I saw a version of myself screaming in silence. The air grew so thin I could feel my lungs collapsing. The vacuum of the glass was finally pulling me in. I looked down at Lily's reflection, but it wasn't her face looking back anymore. It was mine. My own face, 40 years older, rotting in gray, stared up from the polished floorboards between her feet. I realized with a jolt of nausea that I wasn't the father. I was the reflection that had escaped years ago. The real Lily was already on the other side of the glass, screaming soundlessly behind the bathroom mirror. The microshock hit when I felt a seam opening behind my ears. My skin was peeling away like wet wallpaper. I looked at my hands and saw they were made of silver leaf. I wasn't bleeding, I was leaking quicksilver. The other Lily in the room reached up and unzipped her own face. Underneath, there was only a hollow mirror. I vomited, but what came out wasn't bile. It was a stream of jagged, crushed glass that sliced my throat. I finally understood. Lily didn't stop playing with her friend. Her friend just finally finished putting her on the shelf. I'm sitting in the car now, the engine idling in the driveway of a house I don't recognize. My hands are back to normal, but they feel too light, like they're made of hollowed-out porcelain. I looked in the rearview mirror to check my eyes, but there was only a flat, silver void where my face should be. The microshock hit when I realized the car's speedometer was counting down the distance to my own birth. I can hear Lily's laughter coming from the vents, but it's distant, like she's trapped under a thick sheet of ice. I reached for the door handle, but my fingers passed through the plastic as if it were a holographic projection. A figure stepped out of the front door of the house. It was me, wearing the clothes I had on this morning. He waved at me with a slow, deliberate motion, his smile too wide to be humanly possible. The micro-shock came when he leaned down and picked up a hammer, tapping it gently against the driver's side window. I'm still waiting for the glass to break, but I think I'm the one who's going to shatter first. Some reflections should stay hidden, but when you're on the road, sometimes the horror follows you home. This final story proves that some gifts from a trip should never be opened. The hammer is still in my hand. My knuckles are white, slick with a liquid that smells like copper and old batteries. I'm staring into the gap in the drywall. Something is pulling back from the light, and it's wearing my brother's favorite shirt. The air in the studio has turned into wet concrete. I can't breathe, but I can't stop looking at the way its fingers bend. If I blink, it moves closer. I've been staring for 3 minutes, and my eyes are starting to bleed from the dry air. 1 more inch. If it gains 1 more inch, I'm not the one who walks out of this room tonight. It started 3 weeks ago. I bought this place for the acoustics, a concrete shell in a forgotten industrial district. The renovation was supposed to be therapeutic. Just me, a sledgehammer, and a vision for the perfect recording space. Everything felt heavy from day one. The air didn't just sit. It pressed against my skin like a physical weight. I noticed the first oddity while painting the north wall. My shadow was consistently 3 seconds slower than my actual body. The studio was empty, yet my inventory count never stayed consistent. I bought 12 boxes of screws, but I counted 14. I dismissed it as exhaustion. You don't question free hardware when you're working on a shoestring budget and 4 hours of sleep. The drywall in the corner felt soft. Not water-damaged soft, but like pressing your thumb into the side of a ripened fruit. I checked the blueprints I'd pulled from the city archives. This wall shouldn't even exist according to the 1974 floor plan. I tapped the surface. It didn't sound like wood or insulation. It sounded like a hollow chest cavity under a winter coat. A low hum began vibrating through my boot soles. It matched the rhythm of a resting pulse, steady and disturbingly slow. I reached for my utility knife to score the surface. The blade sliced through the drywall like it was warm butter. Behind the board, I didn't find studs or wiring. I found a layer of thick, translucent plastic that felt like skin. A muffled sound vibrated from the puncture. It was the distinct, rhythmic clicking of a mechanical typewriter working at high speed. I pulled back a larger chunk of the board. The gap was barely 4 inches wide, but the darkness inside was absolute. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam didn't travel. It seemed to stop at the threshold of the hole. Then, the reflection in the glass of my recording booth shifted. I was standing still, but my reflection was slowly turning its back. I dropped the flashlight. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, but the light stayed suspended in midair. I reached out to grab the light, but my hand passed through the beam as if the light were solid. The clicking stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so loud it made my ears ring with a high-pitched frequency. I leaned closer to the hole, my heart hammering against my ribs. A faint scent of lavender and rotting meat wafted out. A single, what I blinked from the darkness. It was positioned exactly where a person's mouth should have been. I fell backward, scrambling away. As I hit the floor, the light finally fell and shattered into 1,000 pieces. I grabbed a roll of duct tape from my belt. I needed to seal that hole before whatever was inside decided to come out. My hands shook so violently I dropped the roll. It didn't roll away. It slid upward, defying gravity, sticking to the ceiling. A wet, tearing sound echoed from the wall. The small slit I'd made began to stretch, widening like a healing wound being reopened. I grabbed a piece of plywood to cover the gap. When I pressed it against the drywall, the wood turned soft and fibrous. The plywood began to pulse in time with my heart. I pulled my hands back, terrified of the heat radiating from the surface. I tried to scream for help. My voice didn't come out of my mouth. It broadcasted from the studio monitors behind me. The audio was delayed by 5 seconds. I watched my own mouth move in silence, then heard the scream erupt from the speakers. I lunged for the power strip to kill the sound. The plastic housing felt like cold, dead skin under my sweating palms. I ripped the cords out, but the monitors stayed on. They began playing a grainy video of me entering the studio 3 weeks ago. In the video, I wasn't alone. A blurry, gray figure followed 2 inches behind me, mimicking every single step I took. The figure in the video stopped and looked at the camera. It pointed directly at the hole I just carved into the drywall. I felt a cold draft on the back of my neck. The air in the room suddenly smelled like my childhood home's basement. The wall didn't just bulge, it breathed. Every inhalation pulled the drywall inward until the studs groaned under the pressure. I grabbed a heavy-duty stapler to pin a tarp over the gap. Each staple I fired sounded like a bone snapping. The rhythm was undeniable now. In, out. In, out. The entire studio was a lung, and I was the irritant. I checked my watch. The second hand was moving backward, ticking toward a time that hadn't happened yet today. The tapping started again, but it wasn't a typewriter. It was fingernails against the inside of my own ribcage. I retreated to the center of the room. The floorboards felt like they were floating on a pool of thick oil. Every 3 steps I took, a light bulb overhead would burst. Shards of glass fell upward, sticking to the ceiling like stars. I tried to count my breaths to stay calm. Every time I reached for, a voice whispered 5 directly into my ear. The voice didn't belong to a stranger. It was my own voice, but deeper, distorted by a mouthful of wet sand. I looked at the drywall hole. It had grown into the shape of a doorway, lined with jagged, calcified edges. The impossible shirt I'd seen earlier was draped over a chair that wasn't there a minute ago. I reached for it, but my hand turned translucent. I could see the floorboards through my own palm, pulsing red. The pattern was clear. The room was consuming my reality. It was replacing my world with its own rotting architecture. I realized then that the studio wasn't a building. It was a digestive system, and I was halfway through the throat. The wall whispered my name. Not the name on my driver's license, but the nickname my mother used. Little Bird. The drywall groaned, the sound vibrating through the marrow of my shins. I backed away, tripping over a pile of old Polaroids that hadn't been there a second ago. They were all photos of me sleeping. Some were taken from inside the very wall I'd just opened. The figure in the gap stepped forward. It was wearing the exact scar I got when I was 6. It reached out a hand, and I felt a sharp, stinging pain on my own knuckles. A line of blood appeared on my skin. It matched the jagged cut forming on the creature's hand. I remember the shed. The thing croaked. Its jaw didn't move. The sound came from my own stomach. It was talking about the summer of '98. The secret I'd never told a soul. The room began to bleed ink. Dark, viscous fluid leaked from the electrical outlets, spelling out my deepest regrets. I tried to cover my ears, but the sound was inside my skull, a wet scratching against bone. It knew about the accident. It knew why I'd really moved to this isolated industrial district. The creature's face began to resolve into a mirror image of mine, but with empty, hollow sockets. It smiled, and I felt my own lips stretch painfully wide, tearing at the corners until I tasted salt. I lunged for the heavy steel door. The handle didn't turn. It felt like it was fused to the frame. The windows were gone, replaced by solid, unpainted drywall that felt warm to the touch. I reached for my phone to call for help. The screen was black, reflecting a face that wasn't mine. The signal bar showed no service, then searching, then a string of ancient, flickering symbols. I threw the phone against the wall. It didn't shatter. It sank into the plaster like a stone in a pond. The room began to shrink, the walls closing in by an inch with every heavy heartbeat. I hammered on the door, but the sound was muffled. It felt like I was punching a mattress. The ceiling light flickered out, leaving only a sickly, green glow emanating from the drywall gaps. I looked at the floor. The shadows were detached from the furniture, wandering aimlessly across the boards. The vents began to exhale a thick, gray fog. It tasted like ozone and dried, pressed flowers. I called out for my neighbor, but the air swallowed the sound before it could leave my lips. I was no longer in the city. I was in a pocket of reality that hadn't been mapped yet. I reached into the hole one last time, desperate for a tool, but my hand hit something cold. It wasn't a pipe or a stud. It was a human ribcage, perfectly preserved and still warm. I pulled, and the entire wall peeled away like a scab, revealing what lay beneath the studio. The hidden room wasn't a room at all. It was a massive, taxidermied version of my own body. Thousands of wires were stitched into the giant flesh, pulsing with the studio's electrical current. I looked at my own hands and saw the seams. I wasn't the builder, I was the replacement. The creature in the gap wasn't a monster. It was the original me, discarded and left to rot. It reached out and touched my face, and its skin felt more real than my own plastic flesh. I realized then that the drywall I'd been breaking was actually my own calcified outer shell. I looked back at the hole, and the original me was gone, leaving only an empty husk. The studio is quiet now, but the walls have stopped breathing because I've started. I can feel the electricity humming through my veins, a 60 hertz buzz that never stops. I went to the mirror and tried to cry, but only a thick, gray mineral oil leaked out. The real me is still in the wall, I think, or perhaps he's the one outside now. I found a new roll of drywall tape on the floor, but it's made of human hair. I've started patching the hole, smoothing the plaster with my own numb, plastic fingers. If you pass by the old industrial district, you might hear a faint, rhythmic clicking. Don't come inside, even if you hear me calling your name in your mother's voice. I'm almost finished with the renovation, but I think I left a piece of myself behind the drywall.